The wind howled across the battlements of Winterfell, with a voice older than men, an ancient lament that whispered of lost kings and bitter feuds. Snow lanced down a frigid torrent, veiling the castle in shifting curtains of white. Daylight lingered only as a pale gray suggestion behind the winter clouds. Within the keep's vast halls, every breath carried a fine mist, and torches fought valiantly against the chill as their flames flickered in the draught. Few souls moved about the yard. Servants wrapped in thick furs hurried from stable to kitchen, from blacksmith's forge to great hall, scurrying on tasks with bowed heads and hunched shoulders. Somewhere near the back gates a pair of guards stamped their feet, exhaling plumes of warmth into the biting air. It was nearing the hour of twilight, and in this deep north, that hour came prematurely. Daenerys Targaryen, hood drawn against the winter's clawing touch, stood apart from the bustle. She was perched on a broad section of the outer wall, staring across the distance at the pale horizon. The wind tugged at the silver-blonde strands of her hair. Her gloved hands gripped the stone rampart. She looked outward, seeing and yet not seeing, lost in the swirl of thoughts that now shaped her every waking moment. Beneath her cloak, her body trembled, more from the sense of fate coiling around her than from the cold. It had been weeks since she arrived at Winterfell. The journey northward had been fraught with tension. She remembered the stares of the Northerners, the way they murmured behind her back about dragons, about a Targaryen queen in the seat of House Stark. Tradition weighed heavily upon this land, and tradition stood in quiet opposition to her rule. Yet, in the hush of these stone corridors, Daenerys had learned that the roots of her destiny were not so easily shaken. She was drawn to the gloom beneath Winterfell, the crypts where whispered secrets seemed to resonate like echoes from beyond time. Something there called to her, an ancient current that felt as old as the winter itself. Her dragons, what remained of them, were restless. Yet she could not let them roam freely in the bitter winter storm. Drogon and Rhaegal, grown in flesh and fury, circled the skies from time to time, black silhouettes against gray clouds. But she had discovered 3 strange eggs buried deep in a corner of the keep, or so rumor said. At first it had seemed impossible. How could dragon eggs have found their way into this freezing land? Tales told that a Targaryen had once carried them far and wide, that some had been lost in the chaos of centuries. But in the hidden recesses of old Winterfell, she had felt the stirring energy from those eggs, dormant but powerful. Their shells were black, streaked with a swirling pattern of silver and pale gray, reminiscent of swirling mist against stone. Jon Aegon had not been entirely comfortable with her plan. He had insisted that the crypts were for Stark ancestors, for respect, for memory, for the old ways. She had promised to be discreet, to keep her search quiet, to unearth these rumored eggs only if the faint rumors were true. No one wanted to believe them. But the crypts below Winterfell were labyrinthine, and many places had been all but forgotten. Taking a torch and a quiet group of trusted men, Daenerys had descended. She found them at last in a niche behind a collapsed wall. The eggs had been hidden away, likely centuries ago, wrapped in rotting leather and dusty cloth, sealed behind stones that looked to have shifted during one of the castle's expansions. The sense of discovery had rocked her, and from that moment on, the course of fate shifted in her mind. Now, holding the memory of that discovery close, she turned from the wall and made her way down the stone steps into the yard. Though her heart still hammered with excitement, her face remained composed, every inch a queen who would not bow to winter or to the proud stares of men. She could sense the hush in the yard, as though every onlooker paused in their tasks and listened for rumors. Many eyes followed her, and many tongues wagged. The Targaryen queen who lived among them now was planning something. That was clear in every step of her retinue, every subtle command she gave. She crossed to the great hall, where the warmth of many fires assaulted her senses all at once. The smoky tang of burning wood filled her nostrils. Ghostly shapes in the haze made up the banners of House Stark. She saw the dire wolf emblazoned on their cloth, and it reminded her of Jon, of his austere heritage, and that secret that changed the axis of both their lives. He was not here now. He was out among his men, or possibly speaking to the lords who had gathered to weigh alliances in these uncertain times. She paused by the fire, letting the numbness in her fingers melt away, allowing herself a moment of private reflection. The crypts beckoned to her, a silent call that sang to her blood. Beyond the flickering flames and the murmurs of the hall, she imagined them, those ancient corridors of stone, lined with statues of deceased Starks, each with a direwolf at their feet and a sword across their laps. She remembered the smell, damp, chill and heavy with the weight of centuries. She wondered if the spirits of old kings watched her even now, some approving, some condemning. Could the Targaryen lineage, drenched in fire and blood, ever find peace in these halls built on the bedrock of winter? She pulled away from the hearth, ignoring the hush that followed her exit. Her footsteps carried her deeper into the keep, down quiet corridors where the wind's mournful cry outside was but a distant wail. At the far end of a narrow hall, she found a small passage leading downward. Only a single torch bracket illuminated the way, casting a meager glow upon the step. She lifted the torch from its holder and descended. The stones underfoot were cold and uneven. A swirl of musty air rose to meet her. Each step echoed, a lonely resonance in the depths. There was a sense of intrusion, of crossing into a space not meant for the living. Yet, for Daenerys, there was also a familiarity here. The quiet hush below the earth reminded her of the warmth she had felt once on Dragonstone, exploring hidden corners where old Valyrian relics had lain untouched. Now the magic of this place had a different timbre, cold, old, more primal, but it stirred something in her. As she reached the threshold of the crypt, she held the torch higher. Shadows sprawled across the carved stones and half-effaced statues. The silence was deep, as if the walls themselves had secrets they refused to share. She walked between the statues of former lords, their faces sculpted with grim eyes and guarded mouths, each a silent sentinel. The further she ventured, the less certain she became of her surroundings. It was a labyrinth of memory, passing crypt after crypt. The gentle flicker of torchlight glinted on something at the end of a narrow corridor. When she approached, she saw a small iron gate. Beyond it, the air felt different, colder, or perhaps simply heavier. Standing there, Daenerys let her gaze rest on the spot where she had found the eggs. Carefully re-hidden beneath layers of stone, she had left them there for now, waiting for the right moment. She could almost feel the subtle pulse from behind the wall, a soft warmth that contradicted the biting cold of the tomb. Fire trapped within unhatched shells, waiting for her to give them life. It was as though the ancient energy of the north was entangled with them, ice and fire meeting in the gloom of these halls, forging some unexpected destiny. She heard a subtle sound in the corridor behind her. Turning, she saw Davos Seaworth, quiet and respectful in the gloom. His cloak was heavy wool, a dull gray that blended with the walls. He lowered his head in a slight bow. There was something in his demeanor that suggested he found all this deeply unsettling. Yet his loyalty to her cause, and to Jon, overrode the superstitious unease that might grip another man. "Your Grace," he said softly. His voice seemed to linger in the crypt's cold air, echoing, "I thought I might find you here." She lowered the torch so that the light spread across his face. "It's quiet here." "That it is," he agreed. "The lords are waiting upstairs in the council chamber. Jon Aegon is speaking with them now." She studied him with calm poise. "He can handle them. What do you want to tell me?" Davos hesitated, glancing at the iron gate and the darkness beyond it. He cleared his throat, as though searching for the right words. "The northern lords are wary. They question your intentions, milady. Some wonder if you plan to solidify your hold on these lands by unconventional means." Daenerys' lips pressed into a thin line. "They are not wrong to suspect me. My birthright is not a trifling matter. But I have given them no reason to fear me, aside from the knowledge I command dragons." "Benuex." Davos nodded gravely. But that's enough for many. The North has always seen itself as separate. They fear an outside conqueror. They fear what a dragon queen might do once the war is won, and you've shown them that your dragons are more than a threat to the dead beyond the wall." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the flickering orange of the torch paint shapes against her eyelids. "I will do what is necessary to save the living. After that, if they doubt me still, I will show them I am not my father." Then he inclined his head. "Of course, your grace." She shifted her gaze back to the hidden alcove, the stones that concealed those 3 eggs. Her heart pounded in her chest. "If we are to truly unite, I must prove that I understand the North, and that I'm not afraid of it." She took a step closer to the gate, resting her free hand against the cold iron. "Have any of the Starks spoken of me coming here?" Davos shook his head slowly. "Not that I've heard. Lady Sansa is watchful, and Arya. Well, it's hard to know what that girl thinks. Bran is quiet, as if he sees all but speaks little. You know them as well as I." "Mem." Daenerys pressed her lips together, a fleeting smile of sorrow crossing her face. "They are a family shaped by the North. This crypt is part of them, part of their memory and identity. For me, to be here is an intrusion. But some things are larger than houses and families. Some things are about the future of all Westeros." She brushed past Davos, torch in hand, and walked back down the corridor. Her footsteps left echoes that seemed to chase her through the darkness. He followed, a silent figure in her wake, and neither of them spoke until they climbed the last steps back into the corridor above. The change was almost jarring, from an otherworldly hush to the sound of muffled voices and the distinct clang of steel from the yard. Daenerys handed the torch to Davos, who replaced it in the bracket. She gave him a brisk nod before moving away, her cloak swishing along the cold floor. She made her way to the council chamber, where a handful of northern lords and their sworn men had gathered to confer with Jon. Outside the thick wooden doors, Grey Worm stood with arms crossed, his face as impassive as a statue. At Daenerys' approach, he bowed his head in greeting and pushed the door open for her. She stepped inside to find a somber meeting underway. Candlelight flickered across the faces of Jon, Sansa, and a half-dozen northern lords, each grim, each weighed by the knowledge that a new war loomed. Jon looked up, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of relief brightened his eyes at her arrival. Her heart squeezed at the sight of him. She reminded herself that he was Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir. But in her mind, she still thought of him simply as Jon, the man who had earned her respect and, dare she admit, her love. She took a seat by his side, ignoring the wary glances from across the table. Lord Glover, with his heavy beard and unwavering gaze, studied her as though searching for weakness. Lord Royce from the Vale, who had come in support of Sansa, tried to mask his mistrust with courtesy. Only Lady Lyanna Mormont, small and fierce as ever, seemed to meet Daenerys' eyes with no attempt to hide her open suspicion. Conversations continued, centering on the distribution of supplies, the forging of new weapons, the readiness of the region's defenses. Winterfell was the staging ground for an approaching conflict that many in the realm refused to believe in. No matter the letters sent, the warnings given, the idea of an undead army was still too monstrous to accept fully. And so they planned for multiple threats. The uneasy alliance of the southern lords who might not answer a call to arms, the unstoppable nature of the White Walkers, and the question of how Daenerys' dragons would shift the balance of power. Yet, underlying every word was a tension that had come to define every encounter in the north since Daenerys' arrival. As the meeting drew to a close, Sansa folded her hands before her, regal despite her youth. "The lords have concerns," she said. "We must do our best to address them, or we risk losing their support." Daenerys inclined her head, her voice calm but resolute. "Then they will have their answers soon enough. They will see with their own eyes that I have come to protect, not to destroy." One of the older lords, whose name Daenerys had yet to fully learn, puffed out his cheeks in exasperation. "Words are wind, your grace. Actions speak louder." She allowed a faint smile. "When the time comes, you will see my dragons fight for the north. That is a promise." "Na-wen-ti." An undercurrent of murmurs passed around the table, but no one openly argued. The lords filed out, reluctant, but bound to return to their men and fulfill their obligations. Sansa lingered, standing by the table with arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She gave Jon a pointed glance, then left as well, as though to say that whatever conversation the two Targaryens needed to have, she would not interfere. Jon stood by Daenerys, studying her face. His voice was low when he spoke. "You were in the crypts again." She met his eyes, unwavering. "I needed a moment to think. There is power there." "Mr. Adams," he exhaled slowly. "A power that belongs to House Stark. We bury our ancestors there. I don't want ghosts stirred unnecessarily." Daenerys' gaze flickered. "What I have found isn't just ghosts." He set his jaw. "You found eggs. I haven't told the others, not yet." She was quiet, letting the weight of that statement hang between them. Finally, she spoke in a measured tone. "I don't know how they came to be there. Perhaps an ancestor of mine wanted to keep them hidden from the Baratheons, after Robert's rebellion, or even from the Mad King himself. But if they can be hatched, it could change everything." "Then?" He nodded once, a reluctant acceptance in his face. "I know. But the North is on edge already. If you do this, they'll see it as a threat, not a gift." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "When the dead arrive, or if the Lannisters betray us, these dragons might be what stand between life and destruction. I cannot simply ignore them. Do you remember how my first three hatched?" He took a breath, recalling the story. "You walked into the flames at Khal Drogo's funeral pyre. It was a miracle," everyone said. "Nanakan." She ran her tongue over her lower lip, as if the memory was sweet and painful all at once. "Fire and blood. That's the Targaryen way. But this is different. The North has its own magic. Ice, the crypts, the presence of your ancestors. Perhaps these eggs can be awakened in a new way. Or perhaps I must do something equally drastic." Jon looked at her intently, searching for any hint of doubt in her eyes. "Don't risk yourself like that again." She lifted her chin. "Is there another way? These eggs remain cold. My living dragons born in Essos were spawned by fire. These new eggs might respond differently. Or they might not respond at all, unless I combine both magics somehow." "Then?" A soft, reluctant flicker crossed his gaze. "You mean to use the crypts themselves?" She let out a slow breath, nodding. The whispers in the dark, the sense of an ancient power. "Maybe it's just my imagination, or maybe it's real, but I feel something. I want to harness it. If I can hatch them here, if I can birth new dragons in the seat of your ancestors, it will bind me to the North in a way no lord can ever question." Ice and fire joined. "Nija." Jon did not immediately reply. Instead, he reached out, touching her hand. His voice was rough with unspoken concern. "The living will see it as a threat. The dead, who knows what stir we might cause?" She held his gaze. "You are tied to both realms now. Targaryen and Stark, our child. If the gods grant us one, we'll be the same. We stand on a threshold. Let us forge a new path that merges the best of our houses." He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders lessening. "I trust you, Daenerys, but we must be careful. We cannot force the North's hand. If we do, we risk tearing the alliance apart before the real war begins." "Then?" She accepted this caution with a small, resolute inclination of her head. "Then we will do it quietly. And if it succeeds, if new dragons emerge from Winterfell's crypts, then the North will see that I do not come as a conqueror, but as a liberator offering my own blood and soul." Jon squeezed her hand, then stepped back. His eyes told her he was torn between fear for her safety and loyalty to her quest. "All right," he said at last. "We'll try. But no one else can know. Not until it's done." "I know." She allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of excitement pierce the cloud of uncertainty that had weighed on her since arriving here. She squeezed his hand, then slipped past him to exit the chamber, her heart pounding with newfound determination. That night, the wind abated to a low murmur, and a fragile moon emerged from behind the clouds. Daenerys stood at a table in her quarters, carefully unwrapping the soft cloth she had prepared. A few pouches of rare substances lay ready, smoke-laced leaves from Essos, small vials of pungent oils rumored to facilitate dragon eggs' vitality, and a thick coil of braided hair she had once taken from the pyre where her dragons had been born. She had studied for years the legends of Valyria, gleaned scraps of knowledge about how the old dragon lords tended to eggs, how they used heat from the volcanic mountains to stir life within the shells. Winterfell had no volcanic vents, but beneath it lay natural hot springs that warmed parts of the castle. She had discovered that in certain deeper tunnels, the water that seeped through the rock was still lukewarm, steam curling in the darkness. That hint of heat, combined with the intangible presence of the crypts, might serve as a cradle for the eggs. The risk was great. If she failed, the eggs might remain dormant, or worse, they might crack and lose their potential forever. If she succeeded, she could usher in an era no one had foreseen. Targaryen dragons born of northern gloom. She wrapped the pouches in the cloth bundle and secured it under her arm. She checked the corridor outside her door, ensuring no one lurked nearby. Grey Worm was stationed at the far end, vigilant as always. At her soft command, he escorted her down the winding stairs to a back entrance of the keep. Moonlight pooled in the yard, illuminating a silent world of snow and stone. The guards on the walls stood watch, but most were fixed on the battlements, scanning for foes from without, not from within. Daenerys felt a quiet thrill as she and Grey Worm slipped into a lesser-used corridor that led to the crypts. Two of her loyal Unsullied waited there, posted at her instruction, ready to keep watch. They said nothing, merely bowing their heads in acknowledgement as she passed. Grey Worm paused at the entrance, uncertain whether to follow. She touched his shoulder gently. "I need to do this alone," she said in a voice that brooked no argument. "Stand guard. Let no one enter." Grey Worm pressed a hand to his breastplate. "As you command, your grace." He stepped back, and the crypt swallowed her whole. The passage of light into darkness was abrupt and total, her breathing loud in her ears. The torch she carried sputtered and glowed, its flame dancing in sudden drafts of chill air. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, as though the old kings themselves stirred at her approach. With each step, she felt the heartbeat of the castle's unseen corners. A hush permeated everything, a hush that pressed against her like a living presence. Deeper she went, past the solemn faces carved in stone, down corridors few men traveled. She could not say how she knew which turn to take, or which downward ramp would guide her to the place she sought. She simply felt the pull. At last, she reached the collapsed wall, the small chamber where she had found the eggs. She cleared the rubble carefully, each stone grating in protest as she moved it aside, stacking them in a neat pile to keep the path passable. Her torchlight revealed the eggs resting in the recess of the wall, half covered by dust. She inhaled sharply at the sight of them. Each was the size of a large melon, their shells dark as midnight with swirling patterns of silver. The flickering orange flames gave them a faint sheen, as though a hidden light might pulse beneath the shell. She set the torch in a bracket and knelt, placing the cloth bundle beside her. Slowly, reverently, she laid out the items she'd brought. The vials of oil, the leaves, the braids. She glanced around for the faintest source of heat, unsure if the hot springs extended this far. Carefully, she pressed her hand to the ground. It felt cool, but not frozen. A trace of warmth lingered. Good. Perhaps it would be enough. She drew a circle in the dust, large enough to place the eggs inside. Then she sprinkled the oils, letting them trickle over the stone, forming a shape akin to an ancient sigil that no living maester could replicate with certainty. She had read about it in a half-burnt scroll in a hidden library in Essos, claiming it was once used by the Valyrian dragon keepers. With the circle complete, she placed the eggs in a triangular formation, gently rolling them to rest on their sides. They were cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. She breathed in, steadying herself. Then she took the smoked leaves and set them near the eggs, lighting them with the torch. Thin wisps of pungent smoke rose, curling around the shells. Finally, she took the length of braided hair. This piece had once been soaked in dragon's blood, blood from one of her living dragons, collected carefully when Drogon had been wounded in a skirmish. Binding it in her hair had been a secret ritual of her own. a connection to her children. Now she placed it among the eggs, letting it rest across them like a serpentine coil. She exhaled, eyes fluttering shut. She did not know if words were needed. The old texts mentioned incantations in the Valyrian tongue, but she felt that if the eggs were truly meant to hatch, it would be through something deeper than mere words. She set her hands upon two of the eggs, letting her skin rest against the cold shells. The pungent smoke drifted around her, stinging her nostrils and pulling tears from her eyes. She felt the ground below, the distant thrum of water that had traveled from some subterranean spring to warm the castle's floors. A memory rippled through her mind. The night on the pyre, the rush of flames, the cracking of shells, the cries of newly born dragons. This was different. She would not simply cast herself into the fire. Winterfell was no funeral pyre. The crypt was not ablaze, and she had no cowl's body to offer. But perhaps there was something else. A moment of communion. Her blood, the blood of House Targaryen, might be demanded. Fire and blood. She blinked away the burning smoke, pushing aside the fearful thought that this might all fail. Before she could doubt herself further, she unfastened the clasp of her cloak and slid a small dagger from its hidden sheath. With a steady hand, she drew the blade across her palm, wincing at the sudden sting. She held her hand over the eggs and let her blood drip onto their shells. Tiny red rivulets trickled down the black curves, combining with the silver lines that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. Her breath caught. The smoke seemed to swirl and coil around the droplets, as though tasting them. She clamped her free hand over the cut, steadying herself. For a long moment, nothing happened. The crypt was silent, as though the entire castle held its breath. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. Her eyes roamed over the eggs, searching for even the smallest tremor. They remained still. The oil sputtered in the torchlight. The leaves continued to smolder, but the smoke was thinning. Disappointment threatened to devour her. Perhaps it was folly to think these eggs could be awakened here in the cold dark. She touched the middle egg, feeling the slickness of her blood on its surface. Then she closed her eyes once more, remembering all that she had lost, all that she had fought for. The swirl of images nearly overwhelmed her. The shackles of her youth, the Dothraki sea, the motherly protectiveness she felt for her dragons, the shock of betrayal, the unyielding love she had found in unexpected places. A subtle movement drew her attention. She froze, hand poised over the eggs. Had she imagined it? No. There it was, a faint shiver from the shell, so slight she could have dismissed it as her own trembling. Then again, a minute vibration that passed through her fingertips. She inhaled sharply, glancing down with wide eyes. A faint warmth, almost imperceptible, began to radiate from the spot where her blood had pooled. It was not the scorching heat she remembered from her first eggs. This was more subdued, a slow burn that pulsed like a heartbeat. Her tears returned, unbidden, and she let out a trembling breath. She gently moved her hand to the other two eggs, searching for signs of life. One of them seemed as inert as before, but the second had the same subtle tremor beneath its shell, as though the occupant within stretched cramped limbs for the first time. Her spirit soared, a heady sense of triumph blossoming in her chest. They were not dead. They were not lost. Some seed of life stirred within. She dared not push it further. If the eggs were truly awakening, forcing the process might harm them. She silently thanked whatever energies had granted her this miracle, and withdrew her hands. Her palm throbbed where she had cut it, and she pressed a scrap of cloth over the wound. The crypt felt tighter, as though the air had thickened. She needed time, and the eggs needed it as well. Quietly, she collected her items, leaving the eggs in their circle with the swirling smoke still clinging to the stones. When she rose, she became aware of something at the corner of her vision, a movement in the shadows. Torchlight flickered across a face, half hidden. She spun, heart lurching. Jon stood at the entrance to the small chamber, one hand lifted in caution, his eyes fixed on the eggs. She stared at him, words frozen in her throat. How long had he been there? He stepped forward, carefully, as though approaching a wild animal. His voice was hushed, but resonant in the stillness. "I had to see," he said simply. She swallowed, lowering her gaze. I told you I'd do this alone. He nodded, glancing at the eggs. His features were unreadable, a conflict of awe, concern, and something else. I know, but I needed to be here if something went wrong. His eyes flicked to the dagger in her hand and the faint smear of blood on her palm. Are you hurt? She shook her head. It's just a scratch. Jon came closer, eyes drawn to the eggs in the circle. He hovered at the edge of the arrangement, and she sensed his tension. He was of both Stark and Targaryen blood, a confluence of winter and fire. And she felt something swirl between them that was beyond mere attraction or love. It was as if fate had orchestrated this moment, weaving their stories together in the crypts of an ancient northern stronghold. He exhaled slowly. Did it work? He asked, voice low. She nodded, her lips curving in a trembling smile. They're stirring. 2 of them at least, I can feel it. He hesitated, then placed a hand lightly on her uninjured shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. I hope this doesn't unleash something we cannot control. Daenerys covered his hand with her own, drawing strength from his presence. We'll be careful, but this is our best chance to ensure that the North can stand against all threats. He studied her face, then the circle of eggs again. The flickering torchlight cast a mosaic of shadows across the crypt walls, giving the impression that the surrounding stone kings were watching with hollow eyes. We won't be able to hide them forever. She took a breath. No, but for now, no one else must know. Let them slumber and grow until they are strong enough. By then, it will be too late for anyone to oppose this alliance of fire and ice. Jon lowered his hand and nodded. In the silence that followed, they both sensed the shift in the air. A presence that was not quite malevolent, yet not welcoming either. Like the crypt itself was aware of what had just transpired, this forging of a new legacy in its depths. They stood side by side in that hush, listening to the soft crackle of the leaves, still smoking on the stones, aware that they had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. Finally, she pressed her fingers against the eggs one last time. A gentle warmth answered. Hope flared in her chest. Carefully, she gathered the braids and doused the remains of the smoldering leaves, mindful not to disturb the shells too much. The eggs seemed stable, as though lulled back into a quiet promise of life. Jon offered his arm, guiding her out of the chamber. She cast a lingering glance at the hidden alcove. Were the spirits of Winterfell truly at rest with what she had done? Or had she invoked their ire by bringing Targaryen fire into this domain of the dead? Whatever the answer, she could not turn back now. Fate had already begun to move. They retraced their steps through the crypt, their footfalls echoing in the hollowness of the long passage. Somewhere behind them, far in the dark, Daenerys fancied she heard a distant sound, a soft scraping, like a tiny creature stirring in its shell. She felt her pulse quicken. Ice seeped into her limbs, fighting the flush of excitement that warmed her core. She squeezed Jon's arm, and he glanced at her, a question in his eyes. But she said nothing. Some secrets are best savored in the silent womb of the earth, at least for one more night. As they emerged into the corridor, Grey Worm and the 2 Unsullied snapped to attention. Daenerys looked at Grey Worm, her voice calm despite the swirling tension inside her. You saw no one else come? He shook his head. No one, Your Grace. She allowed a small exhalation of relief. Good. Return to your post. Keep this between us. Grey Worm bowed. Yes, Your Grace. She nodded and moved forward. Jon at her side. Behind them, the crypt door closed with a low groan, sealing in all that had transpired. The hush enveloped them again in the corridor, and they parted ways with the Unsullied. Only when they were alone did Daenerys allow herself a small smile, a flicker of pride mingled with anxiety. Jon noticed and returned a faint smile of his own, though worry still etched lines across his brow. They walked in near silence through the dimly lit halls. Every so often, a random guard or servant would pass, bowing or curtsying. None noticed the blood on Daenerys' palm, or the purposeful set of her jaw. None saw the swirl of smoke that still clung to her cloak in subtle tendrils. The entire keep seemed heavy with the hush of midnight. Finally, they reached a parting of the corridors. Jon's chamber to the left, Daenerys to the right. They paused, as though reluctant to part. Jon gently lifted her injured hand. "You should clean and bandage this." She gazed at the shallow wound. Dried blood crusted around its edges, and a fresh pang of pain reminded her that it was more than a scratch. "I will," she promised softly. "Good night." He hesitated, then leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. She closed her eyes, inhaling his scent of leather and cold iron. When he withdrew, their eyes locked for a moment of shared understanding. They had set something in motion that could shape the fate of the North, and perhaps all the Seven Kingdoms. Without another word, Jon released her hand and turned, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded from earshot. Daenerys entered her chamber, quietly shutting the door behind her. She removed her cloak, inhaling deeply to steady her pounding heart. By the small bedside table, a basin of water and clean rags awaited. She dipped her hand in, wincing as the cold water stung the cut. The droplets ran red at first, then cleared. She dried it gently, letting her mind wander to the crypt, to the eggs, to the promise that stirred beneath their shells. She had done it. Committed an act that might forever tie her to this land she sought to win over. The knowledge sent a strange thrill through her, a sense that she was forging a new tapestry from threads of old magic, weaving fire and ice into a single unbreakable bond. Exhaustion pressed down on her. She dressed for bed slowly, the sting in her palm a reminder of the price that must be paid for great power. Lying beneath thick furs, her eyes traced the shadows that the moonlight cast across the stone ceiling. Sleep would not come easily, not with the memory of those faint tremors beneath her fingers, the warmth that answered her blood. She stared into the darkness, listening to the hush of Winterfell at midnight. She thought of her father, the Mad King, how the realm trembled beneath the memory of his cruelty. She thought of her ancestors before him, the great Targaryen conquerors who rode dragons across the skies. She was different from them, she told herself. She had come to save, not to destroy. And yet, a queen must be strong, sometimes ruthless. Would the North see her kindness, or only her dragons and the threat they posed? Her eyelids fluttered as the night wore on. Far outside, the wind had gathered again, moaning through the courtyard and the eaves. Daenerys drifted between waking and slumber, imagining the eggs in the crypt, hearing their shells crack in her dreams. In those dream visions, she saw ghostly shapes drifting among the stark statues, pale figures that watched over her as she carried the eggs deeper into the earth. She saw swirling snow and torrents of flame, heard the beating of leathery wings overhead as dragons soared among the biting winds of the far north. She heard a roar unlike any dragon's cry she knew, something deeper, older, shaking the roots of Winterfell itself. When morning came, she rose groggily to a pale dawn. The windows showed a sky crowded with leaden clouds, threatening another snowfall. A dull ache dwelt in her injured hand, though the cut was already scabbing. She bandaged it properly with fresh linen. A light knock sounded at her door. Missandei, carrying a steaming bowl of porridge and a pot of fragrant tea. Daenerys welcomed her in with a warm smile, taking a seat by the narrow table. Missandei set down the tray, her eyes flicking to the bandage on Daenerys' hand, a flicker of concern crossing her delicate features. "Are you all right, Your Grace?" Missandei asked softly. Daenerys nodded. "Just a small injury, nothing more." Missandei studied her with quiet scrutiny. Perhaps she suspected more, but she said nothing. She simply poured the tea and offered it. Daenerys sipped the hot liquid, letting the warmth spread through her chest. Outside the door she heard muffled voices. Servants going about their morning chores. The shuffle of guards changing shifts. Another day in Winterfell began, the same as any other. Yet Daenerys knew it was different now. She alone carried the knowledge of what had transpired beneath their feet, of the life that twitched inside those eggs. She glanced at Missandei with a small, thoughtful smile. "Send word to the kitchens that I'd like a breakfast served in the council room within the hour. I want Jon, Aegon there, along with Sansa, and whoever else they wish to bring. We must maintain the show of unity." Missandei bowed her head. "Of course, Your Grace." As the door closed behind her, Daenerys mulled over the day's impending challenges. There would be stares, questions, more demands for reassurance. The northern lords would not rest, nor cease their doubts. But she would meet them all with a regal calm, secure in the quiet secret she held. A single successful hatch could tip the balance of power in a realm overshadowed by the threat of winter. She forced herself to eat the porridge, though she scarcely tasted it. Her appetite was overshadowed by the swirl of planning in her mind. The eggs needed time, seclusion, and warmth. She would need to slip down to the crypts again soon, to check on them, to see if that faint tremble had grown stronger. Should she attempt a second ritual of blood, or wait, letting nature and the subtle energies do their work? A rap at her door interrupted her reverie. She recognized the muffled voice of an unsullied guard announcing that the council gathering was set. She stood, smoothing her dress, and donned a fresh cloak of white fur that Missandei had prepared for her. The color was symbolic, a nod to the north. Perhaps that small gesture would help mollify the lords, if only a little. She stepped into the hallway with measured poise, feeling the hush in the corridors. It struck her that the hush was not only of the physical place, but within herself as well. For all the excitement, for all the fear, she felt a resolute calm. She was Daenerys Stormborn, and her path lay in forging a new world amid the old. The great hall was busy, servants laying out trenchers of bread and hot soup, slabs of smoked meat, and pitchers of spiced wine. A cluster of lords and advisors milled near the tables. Daenerys caught sight of Sansa, speaking quietly with Arya, their red hair a bright splash of color in this grim place. Tyrion stood by the hearth, an uneasy expression on his face, discussing something in low tones with Varys. Jon was there too, leaning over a map with Sir Davos. When Daenerys entered, all heads turned. She wore a polite smile, crossing to Jon's side. He gave a subtle nod, acknowledging her presence. She saw the quiet question in his gaze. Did last night's attempt truly show any promise? She returned a look that was calm and slightly knowing, one that silently told him they would speak later. For now, the demands of leadership took precedence. They had to show a united front if there was to be any chance of persuading the North to stand by them when the White Walkers finally descended. The morning stretched into midday. They discussed patrol routes, fortifications, the rationing of supplies, and the training of new recruits. Gendry, the blacksmith's apprentice who had proven himself in forging dragonglass weapons, reported that the mines of dragonglass from Dragonstone would be shipped north as quickly as possible. Tensions simmered in the room, with Lord Glover and Lady Mormont exchanging pointed remarks about the North's independence. But Daenerys responded with measured, calm assurances, reinforcing that her dragons were here to protect, not enslave. Jon added his voice in firm support, speaking of the war to come, describing once more the horrors he had seen beyond the wall. Eventually, the conversation shifted to the matter of House Lannister's trustworthiness. Tyrion sighed, explaining that while he expected betrayal from his sister, they had to proceed as though they might gain Southern support. Sansa's skepticism was evident, her tone cool and precise. Still, no resolution was reached, only a consensus that they must prepare for the worst. After hours of talk, the group dispersed, each to their tasks. Daenerys let out a breath, the strain of diplomacy wearing on her. She found a moment to exchange a private word with Jon. He spoke softly, eyes flicking around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "Will you return to the crypts tonight?" She inclined her head. "I need to see if the eggs have grown warmer. But perhaps tomorrow night would be safer, so it won't draw suspicion." "You should come." He nodded. "I will." Across the hall, she saw Tyrion watching them, a thoughtful crease in his brow. She knew he was observant, that he might suspect something, but she would trust him only when the time was right. For now, the fewer who knew about the hatching, the better. The day wore on, filled with small duties. She visited the stables, speaking with the stablemaster about the readiness of the horses and the possibility of traveling parties. She spoke with Gendry about forging more dragonlance tips, sets of chainmail that could be combined with the newly mined dragonglass. Whenever she caught sight of the suspicious glances from the northern men-at-arms, she kept her posture tall, her chin high. A queen does not cower in the face of doubt. By nightfall, fatigue tugged at her. Supper was a subdued affair, with most of the lords eating quickly before retreating to plan for the next day's training sessions. Daenerys excused herself early, slipping away to her chambers with Missandei at her side. There, the hush enveloped her once more. She let Missandei brush out her hair, the repetitive strokes soothing. Her injured hand throbbed less now, the scab beginning to knit. Through the window, she saw the sky black with clouds, no moonlight piercing the gloom. She thought of the eggs in the crypt, of the hush in that space that might now be broken by small, incremental stirrings of new life. If the gods willed it, soon the shells would crack, and new dragons would see the world for the first time. They would stretch their wings in the subterranean gloom of Winterfell, forging a bond with the cold stones as much as with the Targaryen who had awakened them. The notion felt surreal, like a story told by some traveling bard in the markets of Meereen. Yet she knew it to be real. She had felt it. At last, Missandei wished her a gentle good night, and Daenerys was left alone with the quiet hush of her room. She let the fatigue claim her, closing her eyes, letting the day's tension slip from her shoulders. Lying there, she listened to the wind moan in distant corridors, the swirl of winter's breath around the towers. In the flickering candlelight, her mind painted visions of hatchlings crawling across cold stones, their eyes aglow with an inner fire that matched their mother's. She imagined them one day flying beside Drogon and Rhaegal, an unstoppable flight of dragons, forging a future unlike any Westeros had ever seen. With that thought, Daenerys drifted into uneasy sleep. Outside, the night deepened, and the hush of Winterfell remained. But in the crypt far below, in that little alcove hidden from prying eyes, the eggs lay resting in a ring of half-dried blood and scented ash, stirred by the faint warmth of ancient springs. Perhaps they dreamt of open skies, or of dark tunnels and the secrets of the north. Their shells vibrated with subtle pulses, each one a promise, each one a portent of the fire yet to come. And in that hush the forces of ice and fire converged, weaving a new story in the subterranean heart of Winterfell. Outside, the sky hung low with heavy gray clouds, a sullen canopy that had not yielded a single ray of sunlight all day. The air smelled of coming snow, and every breath carried the faint tang of frost. Atop Winterfell's walls, guards stared into the vast expanse of white beyond the castle, wary eyes scanning for signs of movement, be it travelers, wildlings, or worse. Though the weather was calm now, everyone knew another storm could roll in at any moment, and with it might come threats far more dangerous than the wind. Within the courtyard, the flicker of torches lit the dwindling afternoon. Servants rushed across the cobblestones, arms piled with firewood, sacks of grain, or bundles of clothing. The entire castle seemed to vibrate with anxious energy, bracing itself against something unseen yet deeply felt. Whispers moved among the people. They sensed tensions in the great hall among the leadership. They sensed a change in the air, as though Winterfell itself was on the cusp of revealing secrets best left buried. Daenerys emerged onto a covered walkway along the inner wall, wearing a cloak of thick white fur that set her apart from the predominantly dark attire of the northerners. Missandei accompanied her, hands folded before her, a small frown etched into her otherwise calm features. They were here to observe the training of soldiers in the yard below. The clang of steel rang out, men sparring with wooden practice swords or battered shields. Sometimes a grunt rose over the din, or a shouted order from Sir Brienne or Sir Davos. The training was rigorous but necessary. The threat of the undead demanded no less. Daenerys swept her gaze over the ring of watchers. She saw a gray worm correcting a soldier's stance with cool precision, Gendry testing the balance of a newly forged halberd, Arya slipping in and out of the crowd like a wraith. It struck Daenerys how varied these people were. Once strangers, enemies, or simply separate folk with disparate loyalties. Now they shared a mission, if not complete trust. She felt the unspoken question lingering around her. Would they see her as ally or invader? She and Missandei descended the stone steps that led into the courtyard, their boots crunching lightly on the accumulated frost. A few heads turned. The soldiers paused in their drills, momentarily distracted by the sight of the Targaryen queen. Lady Brienne, tall and imposing in her armor, offered a respectful bow of her head. Daenerys approached with a poised expression. "Sir Brienne, how goes the training?" Daenerys asked, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard above the clamor. Brienne straightened. "Well enough. They're sturdy. But many lack experience against the kind of enemies we face. Still, they learn quickly." Daenerys watched as a pair of young men swung practice swords in clumsy arcs, each blow accompanied by chattering teeth as cold wind assaulted them. Their instructor shouted for them to keep their guard high. She felt a pang of concern. Even if they mastered swordplay, would that truly prepare them for the inhuman horrors beyond the wall? Her gaze slid away, knowing deep down that each of these soldiers would need every advantage they could muster. Tormund Giantsbane ambled over, his fiery red beard dusted with snow. He flashed a broad grin at Daenerys. "They're tough, these northerners," he said in his gravelly voice. "But if they ever see one of those dead men in the dark, they'll need more than toughness. They'll need courage in their bones." Daenerys inclined her head. "That, I believe they have." He chuckled, slapping the pommel of his sword. Well, let's hope it doesn't fail them." She thanked him and moved on, Missandei close behind. The day progressed in a steady rhythm of sword clashes, shouted instructions, the scrape of steel on the sharpening wheel, and the smell of burnt metal rising from Gendry's makeshift forge. Yet beneath all the noise and bustle, Daenerys felt the quiet presence of the Crypts' secret stirring in her mind. She found her attention drifting inward at times, listening for something that wasn't here in the courtyard, listening for the echo of a heartbeat in stone tunnels below. Jon arrived toward late afternoon, bringing with him a gust of chill air as he crossed from the gate. His cloak, dark and heavy, was crusted with bits of ice. He exhaled fog with every breath. Daenerys noted the subtle exhaustion in his stance, as though he had been riding far. He spotted her from across the yard and made his way over, nodding to men who saluted him on his passage. When he reached her, Daenerys felt an immediate sense of warmth at his presence, though neither showed overt affection with so many onlookers. He spoke in a voice pitched for her ears only. "I checked some of the nearby farms with a patrol. The food stores are adequate, though not abundant. They're willing to spare grain if we ensure their safety." "Mornin'." Daenerys gave a small nod. "We'll do our best to protect them, but resources here are stretched thin. Winter is not kind." His gaze flickered to Missandei, who tactfully drifted away to inspect a row of shields stacked by the wall, giving them a pocket of privacy. He leaned closer, dropping his tone even further. "We should talk about the Crypts tonight, away from prying ears." She glanced at his face, reading the tension there. "Did something happen?" He pressed his lips together before replying. "I asked Bran if he senses anything unusual in the castle's depths. He has a talent for seeing things others do not." Jon paused, searching her eyes. He wouldn't speak plainly, only said there's movement in the dark, and that it's not a threat, yet. Daenerys inhaled slowly, a subtle shiver chasing across her skin that had nothing to do with the cold. "We suspected as much. 2 of the eggs were stirring. I only hope it continues. We'll go tonight. You can stand guard for me if you will." He nodded. "Of course." A shout from across the courtyard drew their attention. Sir Davos, beckoning Jon. With a final, significant look, Jon excused himself and strode away, leaving Daenerys to wrestle with her own thoughts. She lingered a bit longer, speaking with a few of the drill instructors, offering words of praise or encouragement. Then she retreated into the keep, her cloak trailing on the icy ground behind her. Inside, the castle corridors were warmer by comparison, though still chilly enough for her to keep her furs drawn tight. She passed through the great hall, glimpsing a few men at a far table arguing quietly over maps and ledgers, likely adjusting supply routes. None noticed her slip by. Eventually, she found the library, a modest chamber lined with shelves of old tomes, thick with dust. She breathed in the musty aroma of parchment and leather bindings. Maester Walken was there, his head bent over a battered volume, lips moving silently as he read. Daenerys approached him softly. He looked up, startled by her presence, then hastily rose to bow. She waved a hand for him to remain seated. I only wanted to see if you had any records pertaining to House Targaryen and its dealings with the North." His eyebrows lifted, surprise flickering across his face. "Dealing with the North, Your Grace. Records on that topic are scant. Most of what we have details warfare, including the last time dragons were seen here centuries ago. There's mention of Queen Alysanne traveling north with her dragon Silverwing to meet with the Starks, but not much detail on that. The knowledge of dragons was not well preserved after Robert's rebellion." She nodded, carefully considering her words. "It's all right. If you find anything that seems unusual, mentions of lost eggs, or Targaryens visiting Winterfell in secret, please let me know." His eyes narrowed in curiosity. "I will, though I suspect such records might be fragmentary at best." She thanked him and departed. As she walked through the corridors, she found her thoughts consumed by the eggs in the crypt. There had to be a reason they ended up here. Perhaps some distant Targaryen kin had once hidden them, hoping the warmth of Winterfell's springs would keep them from withering away. Or maybe they'd been placed here to ensure no one else could claim them. The lack of concrete answers only deepened the mystery, heightening Daenerys' conviction that hatching them was a path she must follow. She returned to her chamber to pass the remaining daylight, in careful preparation. She changed into a simpler gown, one easier to move in, draping a dark cloak over it rather than her white fur. If she were to venture into the crypt tonight, she preferred not to draw attention. Missandei helped her weave her hair into a single thick braid, tying it securely. Daenerys' heart thumped with anticipation. The hours stretched, seeming too long in their slow passing. At last, the night came. A meal was served in the great hall. Hot spiced wine, stewed vegetables, chunks of roasted meat. Daenerys ate sparingly, her appetite dulled by anticipation. Jon was seated near her, quiet and thoughtful. Sansa and Arya were to his right, talking in low voices. Tyrion and Davos sat across from Daenerys, engaged in a subdued debate about possible southern alliances. Varys lingered at the edges, ever watchful, reading the subtle shifts in the room with eyes as keen as a cat's. When the meal ended, Daenerys excused herself with polite words. She saw Jon rise as well, but he took a different route, presumably to avoid suspicion. Daenerys glided from the hall, head high. She passed through the castle's winding passages, occasionally tipping her chin in acknowledgement to any guard or servant she encountered. At each turn, she felt her pulse quicken. Soon, she was at the discreet doorway that led toward the crypts. Grey Worm and two Unsullied stood watch just outside. At her approach, Grey Worm bowed, his eyes betraying the slightest concern. "Your Grace," he said, voice subdued in the still corridor. She gave him a brief nod. "Is it secure?" He hesitated, glancing at the door. "No one else has passed here tonight." "Good. Stay alert. Let Jon Snow through when he arrives. No one else, and this remains between us." Grey Worm's jaw tightened. "Yes, Your Grace." She slipped inside, descending into darkness, lit only by her single torch. The air changed from the faint warmth of the keep's corridors to the cold stillness of the underground. Each footstep sent echoes bouncing off the stones. The images of Stark ancestors watched from their alcoves, carved faces silent and somber. She passed them, her torchlight illuminating the stern visages and the stone direwolves at their feet. As she ventured deeper, the hush thickened, wrapping itself around her like a tangible shroud. She was attuned now to the crypt's presence, the interplay of old magic, the faint warmth from hidden hot springs. It was an oppressive yet strangely comforting atmosphere, as though the spirits here were neither friend nor foe, but watchers who bore witness to her quest. At length, she reached the chamber where the collapsed stones concealed the eggs. She set her torch in a bracket on the wall, then crouched to move aside enough rubble to gain entry. The hush in this place felt deeper still, and her own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. She slipped inside, half expecting to see cracks in the eggs or fragments of shell scattered across the floor. But in the glow of her torch, she saw them still resting in their triangular formation, exactly as she had left them. The circle of ash and dried blood remained as well, though it had been disturbed slightly, as though a small tremor had rattled the floor. She knelt, reaching out to lightly touch one of the eggs. The shell felt faintly warmer than before, though still cool compared to living flesh. She concentrated, letting her senses roam across its surface. Yes, there was a rhythmic pulse, subtle as a whisper. She dared a soft smile. Another egg felt only marginally warm, but again she sensed the bare stirring within. The third was cold, unresponsive. Gently, she picked it up, cradling it in her arms as though it were a newborn child, hoping her own warmth might kindle some spark. A quiet scuff of footsteps made her glance up. Jon had arrived carrying his own torch. He carefully slid into the alcove, extinguishing the flame once the cramped space was lit enough by her own. His eyes roved over the eggs, then settled on the one in her hands. "Do you feel a difference?" he asked, hushed. "Yes," she murmured. "These two have a heartbeat, but this one..." She brushed her thumb over its rich shell. "I'm not certain." Jon crouched beside her, his face serious in the flickering torchlight. He placed a hand on the cold egg and frowned. "I feel nothing," he said softly. She pressed it closer to herself. "Perhaps it needs more time, or maybe it never had life in it." A pang of sadness touched her words. Jon's gaze moved to the other two, resting in their circle. "You said you gave your blood." She nodded, recalling that moment. It seemed to stir them. But a single offering may not be enough. "I remember how my first dragons hatched. I walked into the flames of Drogo's pyre. Perhaps the crypt demands a different sacrifice." "No, well, Sal." He tensed at the word sacrifice, and she saw shadows cross his eyes. "No more risks like that. We'll find a way without endangering you." Daenerys placed the cold egg down gently. "It's not always about endangering ourselves. Blood, warmth, and time could be enough. I feel these two moving, like they're half asleep, waiting for the final spark." Jon studied the faint glimmer of warmth in the stone beneath them. A thin wisp of steam rose from a crack near the wall. The hot springs must lie close to this chamber. He turned to her, voice low. "We could try to build a small heat source here. Not a fire so large that it risks the castle, but enough to create a warm environment around the eggs. The hot springs will help, but maybe we can intensify it." Daenerys nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but it must be done in secret. We can't have the castle's inhabitants noticing smoke from below. Rumors would spread faster than ravens fly." Jon considered the challenge in silence. The hush of the crypt enveloped them, magnifying every tiny sound. The drip of water in a distant corridor, the soft shift of Daenerys' cloak, the beating of their hearts. Finally, he spoke again. "There are old channels that carry warm water through Winterfell's walls, used to heat the floors in certain rooms. Some are still functional, some partially collapsed. If we can direct a bit of that water to this chamber, it might raise the temperature enough." Her eyes flickered with interest. "You know these channels?" He gave a slight shrug. "I grew up here, but I'm no expert. Maester Walken, or the older builders, might know more. We can't exactly reveal our purpose, but we might find an excuse. Like we're checking the castle's foundations, or ensuring the crypt isn't flooded." "Dan." She smiled in gratitude. "That could work." Together, they set about examining the corners of the hidden alcove for any sign of a place to channel water. By torchlight, they found small cracks and openings, some blocked by debris. It wouldn't be simple to expand these passages. The stone was thick, and any excavation risked drawing attention. Still, the beginnings of a plan formed between them. Daenerys returned to the eggs, gently touching the two that responded. She felt that quiet pulse once more. It made her breath catch. The promise of life in so bleak a place. "They're getting stronger," she whispered, eyes shining. Then she looked at Jon, her voice hushed with awe. "Imagine. New dragons born of Winterfell's crypts." Jon's expression was cautious but hopeful. "I can scarcely believe it." She laid her palm over one shell, the scab on her hand pressing against it. "I must do more." He gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "Don't push too hard. Let me help carry the burden." They gazed at each other under the wavering torchlight, the presence of something greater than either of them filling the cramped chamber. Then Daenerys carefully placed the eggs in a protective arrangement of stones, ensuring they wouldn't roll or be disturbed. She and Jon smoothed the debris back over the opening, masking their presence as best they could. If anyone ventured into these corridors, They would see nothing unusual, only a collapsed wall in a remote corner of the crypt. Before leaving, Daenerys lingered, her hand pressed to the cold stone. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent promise that she would return, that she would fulfill whatever destiny demanded of her and these eggs. Jon watched quietly, then offered her the light of his torch as they made their way out, retracing the steps back to the main crypt path. At the entrance, Grey Worm stood ready with his men. Jon gave them a nod. The corridor up ahead was dimly lit by a single sconce, creating dancing shadows that played across the walls. Daenerys paused, turning to Jon. "We should each return separately." He agreed with a curt nod. "You go first. I'll wait a bit." She studied his eyes. There was so much she wanted to say. About trust. About her hopes and fears. About the possibility that these new dragons could shift the balance of power in the war and in the realm. But the hallway was no place for confessions. She merely touched his arm, lingering a moment, then moved on with measured steps. Grey Worm and the Unsullied followed her, escorting her back through the corridors of Winterfell. When she arrived at her chamber, Missandei was there, tending to a small fire in the hearth. She turned at Daenerys' entrance, concern evident in her soft gaze. "You've been below again, haven't you?" Daenerys nodded, lowering her hood. "Yes." Missandei let out a gentle breath. "Forgive me, but I can't pretend not to worry. I know you're doing something dangerous or secretive. You've been quiet, distant. If there is anything I can do to help..." Daenerys smiled, touched by her friend's devotion. "Thank you, Missandei. Your concern warms my heart. But I must keep this to as few people as possible, for now. Trust that I'm doing what I must." When Missandei's eyes flicked to the bandage on Daenerys' hand, then back to her face. She inclined her head, though worry still creased her brow. "Very well. I only wish to see you safe." Daenerys nodded, crossing to the fire. She stretched her hands toward the flames, embracing the heat. "I'll be careful," she said softly. "But sometimes to achieve what the realm needs, we must walk a path of uncertainty." Missandei's answer was a gentle gesture, a silent acceptance of her queen's choice. They spoke no more of it, and Daenerys allowed herself to be aided out of her cloak, letting the day's aches settle in her body. Sleep beckoned, but her mind raced with thoughts of the crypt, of the eggs, of what the nights ahead would bring. She settled into bed, hearing the hushed crackle of the fire, breathing in the faint scent of burning pine. Dreams came swiftly, full of swirling imagery. Dragons coursing through a moonlit sky of snow, the hum of an ancient power calling her name, and the echo of distant roars deep in the earth. The morning arrived with a dull light filtering through overcast skies. Daenerys woke groggy, but alert, the memory of her dreams lingering like phantoms. She rose, dressed, and made her way to the council meeting that had been scheduled for mid-morning. The lords and ladies gathered in the great hall wore grim expressions. A fresh layer of snowfall coated Winterfell's rooftops, and the cold seemed deeper than ever. Sansa arrived in a swirl of gray furs, greeting Jon and Daenerys with a polite dip of her head. Arya stood beside her sister, silent but perceptive. Tyrion and Varys exchanged small pleasantries, while Davos and Brienne remained in earnest discussion about supply lines. As they settled at the central table, servants poured hot tea and set out bread and cheese. Sansa began the meeting by recounting updates from the lands surrounding Winterfell. How many farmers were left to gather crops? How many had sought refuge in the castle? Jon provided details from his patrols, noting that more wildlings were migrating south, trying to escape the advancing cold. Daenerys listened intently, contributing where needed, careful to maintain the composed front of a queen. Yet she felt her heart flutter each time the conversation turned away from immediate threats. She wanted to speak of the potential advantage that new dragons would bring, but revealing the eggs too soon might incite fear or hostility. Near the end of the meeting, Lady Lyanna Mormont spoke up, her sharp young voice cutting through the somber hush. "How long do we wait for the southern lords to rally, if they rally at all? Winter is here. Our stores are not enough to feed a standing army for a prolonged war, let alone an endless winter." "No." Tyrion cleared his throat. It's true we have no guarantees from the south, but I have it on good authority that some lords in the Reach may still aid us, if only to protect their own lands from any eventual threat. We cannot fight the dead alone. Lyanna's mouth thinned. We'll fight them whether we have southern help or not. Jon intervened gently. We will, my lady. But it's better if we have allies at our side. The enemy we face is relentless. That's no. Daenerys added in a measured tone. My dragons will also be vital in the battles to come. Their fire is our greatest weapon against the Whites and White Walkers. At the mention of dragons, the mood shifted uneasily. Some of the northern lords exchanged glances, lips pressed thin. The memory of a single dragon's destructive might could inspire awe or dread. Sansa observed them closely, a thoughtful glimmer in her eyes. Arya, with her unblinking stare, revealed no emotion, while Lady Mormont seemed to wrestle with a mixture of pride and skepticism. Eventually, they concluded the meeting with an agreement to send out more scouts to gather intelligence. As the lords rose to leave, many bowed stiffly to Daenerys, their respect still tempered by uncertainty. Sansa lingered, exchanging a few quiet words with Tyrion and Varys. Jon beckoned Davos to discuss their next steps regarding patrol routes. Daenerys hovered by the hearth, letting the heat warm her limbs. Now that the meeting was over, the hush of the crypt returned to the forefront of her mind. She knew she couldn't keep these secret visits hidden forever. Sooner or later, the realm would discover the new dragons, if they hatched successfully. And then everything would change. When the hall emptied, Tyrion approached Daenerys. He clasped his hands behind his back, his expression contemplative. Your Grace, may I have a word? She nodded. Of course. His gaze flicked to the empty doorway. I noticed your nightly excursions. You're not exactly strolling in the moonlight for pleasure, are you? Daenerys allowed herself a hint of a smile. What do you think I'm doing, Lord Tyrion? He pursed his lips, considering. Something related to those rumors about the crypts, I suspect. There have been whispers of strange things below. If you needed my counsel, you know I'm always here. She offered a slight inclination of her head. I appreciate your concern, but for now, it's a private matter. Tyrion pressed his advantage gently. A private matter that involves unsullied guards standing watch, and you returning with a certain glow in your eyes. Pardon me for saying so, but I know the look of someone who believes they've discovered a hidden advantage. If it helps our war effort, I would argue it's not entirely private. Daenerys' voice remained calm, though inside she bristled at the intrusion. All in time, Tyrion. When the moment is right, I will share what I must. He studied her carefully, then sighed. Very well. Just remember, too many secrets can sow mistrust, especially here in the north. They have long memories of foreign rulers who kept them in the dark. She nodded, words clipped. Noted. He inclined his head, then turned and walked away, leaving her alone by the hearth. She clenched her jaw, exhaling a slow breath to steady herself. Tyrion's logic was not wrong. The longer she concealed the nature of her activities, the greater the risk of suspicion. But how could she reveal the truth before the eggs were ready? She imagined telling the lords that she, a Targaryen queen, planned to bring forth new dragons in the sacred crypt of their beloved Starks. It would ignite a firestorm of debate, fear, or outright rebellion. No, better to wait until the eggs had truly hatched, when she could present them as a fait accompli and an undeniable boon to their cause. In the days that followed, Daenerys quietly worked to gather information about Winterfell's hot spring channels. She asked Davos, in a roundabout way, whether any part of the castle's lower chambers was at risk of flooding or collapse. He, in turn, consulted with some older members of the staff who had knowledge of the subterranean passages. Daenerys gleaned bits and pieces. The hot water flowed through large metal pipes in certain areas, some of which were rumored to be in disrepair. If she could redirect a little of that warmth to the chamber with the eggs, she might create the ideal conditions. But how to do so without drawing notice? She confided in Jon, who brought up Gendry's name. If anyone could tinker with metal or forge a discreet pipe, it was Gendry. Daenerys agreed. Yet she hesitated. Gendry had close friendships with members of the Stark household, and the man carried Robert Baratheon's blood. Could he be trusted with this Targaryen secret? Jon believed yes, citing Gendry's loyalty to their shared cause and the gratitude he owed for being liberated from the Red Woman's designs. Daenerys remained cautious, but decided it might be a risk worth taking. Thus, one snowy morning, as the blacksmith labored at the forge, Daenerys and Jon approached him. Gendry glanced up from the anvil, sweat mixing with the soot on his brow despite the cold. He offered a respectful dip of his head. "Your Grace, my lord." Daenerys studied the young man. His arms were corded with muscle, yet there was an openness in his face that she found reassuring. "Gendry," she said in a measured tone, "I understand you have a skill for forging more than just swords. Jon tells me you're clever with metalwork." Gendry shrugged, modest. "I can't claim to be a master of contraptions, but I've repaired a few boilers and pipes in Flea Bottom. Back in King's Landing, the place was half falling apart." Jon stepped closer, crossing his arms. "We need a small modification in one of Winterfell's lower chambers. Something to carry hot water discreetly." Gendry's brows rose. "I can try, but it depends on how large a pipe you need and where it's coming from." Daenerys kept her voice calm. "We'll show you the area, and you can tell us if it's possible. The important thing is that no one else can know. Do you understand?" Gendry nodded, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He didn't pry, but she could tell he was asking himself why the Queen and Jon Snow needed this done in secret. Still, his loyalty proved stronger than his questions. "When do we start?" "Tonight," Jon said quietly, "after most have turned in." So it was decided. That evening, under cover of darkness, Jon led Gendry to a section of the crypt near the hidden alcove. Daenerys joined them, wearing her more practical attire. Their torches illuminated a part of the hallway she had not ventured into much before. Ancient cobwebs hung from the vaulted ceiling, and the air smelled of damp stone. They found an old metal pipe hugging one wall, partially rusted. Warmth radiated from within it, indicating hot water flow. Nearby was a section that branched off and ended in a broken valve. Gendry tapped the metal, listening to the resonance. He nodded, brow furrowed. "I think I can fit a smaller pipe here, redirecting some of the water further down. It won't be a flood, more a trickle of heat. But the piping that goes deeper has collapsed or rusted away, so I'll have to craft something new." Daenerys watched him carefully. "And how soon can it be done?" He inhaled, rubbing at the back of his neck. "A day or two to make the pipe, maybe another to install it without making too much noise. I'll have to time it when no one else is working in the forge, but I can manage." Jon nodded, placing a hand on Gendry's shoulder. "Thank you." Gendry looked at Daenerys, as though weighing whether to ask the question that sat on the tip of his tongue. Finally, he ventured, "This is to help with the war effort, right? I mean, I'll do it, no matter what, but..." Daenerys gave him a measured smile. "It is. Someday soon, you'll see how, and you'll understand why secrecy matters." He nodded, accepting it with quiet resolve. "Very well. I'll get to work tomorrow." They made their way back up, splitting off to avoid being seen together. As Daenerys returned to her chambers, a flutter of hope stirred within her. Step by step the plan was taking shape. If Gendry succeeded, they could create a warm environment in the crypt that might help the eggs hatch. Then, if fate smiled upon them, the world would soon witness a sight not seen for an age: the birth of dragons in the heart of Winterfell. The next 2 days passed in a blur of hushed coordination and subtle maneuvers. Gendry crafted a length of pipe in sections, forging them at odd hours, explaining to any who asked that he was working on a new method of channeling heat for the blacksmith's corner of the courtyard. Most believed him without question, as the cold made any talk of improved heating seem sensible. He hammered and shaped the metal, tested the connections, ensuring there would be no leaks. He also prepared a new valve system, a small lever that would allow them to control how much hot water flowed. Jon kept watch for any unwanted interest, redirecting guards to other tasks if they drifted too near Gendry's work. Daenerys managed the broader affairs of the castle, all the while checking discreetly on the crypts when she could. Each time she ventured there, the 2 eggs seemed minutely warmer, the pulses slightly stronger. She could almost hear the faint flutter of wings waiting to be born. Or perhaps that was just her own heartbeat, echoing with anticipation. On the appointed night, Gendry and Jon carried the new metal pieces down into the crypts, Daenerys following behind with a torch. Gendry quietly set to work, removing the old rusted valve. The sound of metal scraping on stone rang in the small corridor, and each time it grew too loud, they paused, listening for any sign of others. When the coast was clear, he continued, face glistening with sweat from both exertion and tension. Daenerys held the torch steady, glimpsing Jon's focused expression in the warm glow. The hush of the crypt mingled with the pounding in her chest. After what felt like hours, Gendry fit the new pipe onto the main line and tightened the clamps. He carefully sealed the joints with a resin he'd heated and thinned, then used iron bands to reinforce them. Finally, he installed the makeshift valve. He exhaled, shoulders sagging in relief. That should do it. If I open this lever slightly, the water will flow into the new section and run downward. It might take a while to reach the chamber, assuming the path isn't blocked. But if it is, you'll need to clear it out. Stay. Jon inspected the work. We'll check the path. Thank you, Gendry. Gendry gave a small bow to Daenerys. I hope it helps. She placed a hand on his arm. You've done your part admirably. This will be remembered. Now go. Rest. Make sure no one notices you missing. He nodded, collecting his tools. In another moment he was gone, his footsteps receding into the upper corridors, leaving Daenerys and Jon alone in the hush. They exchanged glances. Both of them felt the tension, the possibility that they were on the brink of a great turning point. They moved deeper into the crypt, making their way to the hidden alcove. Sliding back the rubble, they entered the small chamber where the eggs lay. The air felt faintly warmer, though only marginally so. Jon knelt by the corner where a small channel in the floor led away into darkness. He placed his hand near it, then nodded in satisfaction. A bit of warm air is coming through already. If we can keep this steady, the temperature might rise enough. Daenerys went to the eggs. By torchlight, she studied each carefully. The first two still gave off that soft warmth, the faint beating from within. She gently cupped each in turn, closing her eyes to sense their stirring. The cold egg remained unresponsive, though perhaps its shell felt a touch less icy. She held it against her body, letting her own warmth transfer, as if coaxing it toward life. Jon watched her, something akin to awe in his eyes. If this works, you'll have done what I thought impossible. She set the cold egg down with care. I won't celebrate until I see them break shell. Then she took a breath, her tone turning reflective. When that day comes, the North will have no choice but to accept me. They can't deny the power of dragons, born here in their own land. Jon stood, coming to her side. Just promise me you won't use them to burn any who oppose you. Show them you are different from. She raised a hand gently, silencing him. I know what you fear. I am not the Mad King. I will not let these creatures become instruments of cruelty. They will defend the living, just as I will. He searched her face, his voice quiet. I believe you. They spent a few more moments examining the chamber. The air was growing thick with a mild humidity, a veil of warmth seeping from that newly installed pipe. Water trickled somewhere behind the wall. Daenerys hoped that, with time, this would mimic the conditions under which dragons once thrived in the volcanic tunnels of Valyria and Dragonstone. The North was an unlikely cradle for such beasts, yet here they were, forging a destiny no one had foreseen. When at last they returned to the corridor, Daenerys heard a whisper of movement. She and Jon froze, exchanging a tense glance. Then, out of the gloom, stepped Arya, moving as silently as a cat. The torchlight revealed her pale face, her eyes intent. Daenerys felt her pulse leap. Had Arya seen them? Overheard their conversation? Arya regarded them calmly, her posture relaxed but unreadable. Jon spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. Arya, what are you doing down here? Arya cocked her head. I could ask the same of you. It's late. She glanced between Jon and Daenerys. You've been sneaking down here often. Daenerys felt the weight of that observation. She studied Arya's face, uncertain how much the young Stark had deduced. There was cunning in her gaze, and a slight tilt of her mouth that suggested she was ready to keep her knowledge close. Jon stepped forward, placing himself partly between Arya and Daenerys, as though to shield the queen from an uncomfortable revelation. "We're inspecting old passages," Jon said, voice low, "ensuring the crypts are safe. That's all." Arya's smile was faint, almost playful. "Are you sure?" She took a step closer, her eyes flicking to the residual dust on Daenerys' cloak, the edges of stone debris near the concealed alcove. "There's something behind that wall you're clearing. The old part of the crypt. I wonder why it's so important." Daenerys spoke in a calm, measured tone. "The old part of the crypt could be dangerous if it collapses. We can't risk curious people venturing there and getting hurt." Arya studied her a moment longer, then her gaze slid to Jon. Something unspoken passed between them. Shared loyalty, perhaps tempered by caution. At length, Arya nodded. "I'll keep your secret for now, but if this, whatever you're doing, puts Sansa or the North at risk, I'll want answers." Jon reached for Arya's arm gently. "It won't harm the North. You have my word." She nodded, though her eyes still held a flicker of doubt. Then, without another word, Arya turned and melted back into the corridor's shadows. Daenerys and Jon remained still, listening for the fade of her footsteps. When silence returned, Daenerys let out a slow breath. "That was close," she murmured, glancing at Jon. "We need to be more careful." He ran a hand over his face, clearly unsettled. "She won't betray me. Arya's loyalty is to her family first. She won't stay silent if she thinks there's danger." Daenerys pursed her lips. "Then we must ensure we pose no danger to the Starks or the North. Once the dragons hatch, assuming they do, we have to show her that it's a boon to everyone." "Nasi," he nodded, though worry etched lines across his brow. Together, they left the crypt, each step feeling heavier than before. The weight of secrecy pressed on them like the winter skies above. If Arya suspected more, who else might be watching? The days that followed brought further snowfall. Winterfell's courtyard became an expanse of white, the training yard coated in ice and slush. Soldiers huddled around braziers for warmth when not drilling. Daenerys maintained her queenly duties, meeting with the lords and seeing to the daily needs of the keep. Meanwhile, she and Jon continued discreet visits to the crypts. The new pipe Gendry installed worked well enough, creating a modest warmth in the hidden chamber. Each time Daenerys checked the eggs, the two that responded felt a little warmer, their shells carrying a faint tremor of life. Yet the third egg remained cold, unyielding. She tried to hold it, to speak softly to it, as though coaxing a child to wake. The results never changed. A sorrow tugged at her heart each time she compared it to the others. Perhaps not every egg was meant to hatch. Still, she refused to give up hope entirely. If the rest hatched, maybe the heat from newborn hatchlings would spark it to life. As the nights lengthened, the hush within the crypt deepened, occasionally broken by distant echoes, or the soft trickle of running water through newly laid pipes. Daenerys found herself spending more time in this secret womb of possibility, guided by the warmth of her torch and the steady presence of Jon by her side. The hush became a companion, a silent witness to the forging of an alliance that could remake the North, or break it if mistrust prevailed. Outside, the storms continued. Word came of the White Walkers' advance, rumored sightings north of the last hearth. The lords of the North grew increasingly grim, their patience with southern alliances thinning. Sansa pressed Daenerys more firmly about the distribution of limited resources. Arya's cool gray eyes seemed always to be watching, quietly assessing. Tyrion tried to broker cordial relations, but tension crackled beneath every conversation. One dusk, as Daenerys prepared to descend once more to check the eggs, she encountered Sansa in the corridor near the library. The young lady of Winterfell wore a heavy cloak of dark gray, her auburn hair braided to one side. She studied Daenerys with an unflinching gaze. "Your Grace, have you a moment?" Daenerys paused, inclining her head. "Of course." Sansa gestured for her to follow into a smaller reading room, where a single candle flickered on a table. When they were alone, Sansa closed the door. She leaned against the wall, arms folded. My sister says you and Jon have been spending a lot of time in the crypts. She suggested you're examining structural issues. Yet I feel there's more to it. Daenerys kept her composure, meeting Sansa's gaze without flinching. We are ensuring Winterfell is prepared for the coming war. The crypts must be secure, especially if people need to shelter there. Sansa's lips pressed into a thin line. I respect you, Your Grace, for aiding the North against the White Walkers. But you must understand, I've seen how secrets tear families apart. You are in my home, and I will not have mysteries here that could harm the people I love. Nessun said. Daenerys' voice softened, not yielding but seeking to assure. I'm not here to harm your family, Lady Sansa. Everything I do is for the greater good of the realm. I cannot reveal every detail yet, but I promise you, when the time is right, I will. Sansa's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Daenerys. I want to trust you, she said quietly, but trust must be earned. Jon may have pledged his loyalty, and Arya may hold her tongue, but you're still a stranger to the North. We fought too hard to let it fall to ruin again. No. Daenerys inclined her head slowly. I understand. I will do what I can to prove my intentions. In the meantime, I ask for your patience. Sansa studied her for a long moment, as if attempting to read the sincerity in her eyes. Finally, she nodded, stepping aside to let Daenerys pass. Very well, but be warned. Winterfell does not forgive treachery easily. With that, she slipped out of the room, leaving Daenerys alone by the flickering candle. Daenerys exhaled, feeling the tension coil in her chest. Sansa was no fool. If the eggs hatched too soon, or if something went amiss, the repercussions could be dire. She composed herself, gathered her resolve, and continued on her way. That night, she descended to the crypt once more, alone. Jon was away, speaking with the northern lords on the state of their mustering forces. Daenerys insisted he focus on that duty rather than risk more joint appearances beneath the castle. Grey Worm waited at the door, face expressionless as always, stepping aside to let her pass. She walked through the cold darkness, torch held high, her footfalls echoing in the vaulted passage. When she reached the hidden alcove, her breath caught in her throat. A new warmth greeted her, even before she slid away the rubble. The air was noticeably hotter than before, a tangible shift in temperature. She hastily cleared the stones and peered in. The torchlight fell upon the eggs. 2 of them lay in place, and as she watched, she saw one twitch, an unmistakable jerk of movement. Her heart thundered. She slipped inside, nearly dropping the torch in her eagerness. The pulse was so strong now she could feel it in the air. A slow, rhythmic throb. She knelt beside the eggs, hands trembling. A fine sheen of condensation clung to their shells, as if they'd begun to sweat. She gently touched the one that moved, feeling a vibration that ran from her fingertips up her arm. It was strong, urgent. The second egg, too, felt alive, almost quivering under her hand. Tears pricked at her eyes. It was happening. Then her gaze went to the third egg. She reached for it with trembling hope. At first, she felt nothing, cold as stone. Yet as she pressed her palm against it, closing her eyes and focusing, she detected a faint flicker, almost a single heartbeat. She gasped, gently tracing its ridges. Come on, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You can do this. A sudden crack echoed in the hush. Her eyes flew open. One of the eggs, she couldn't tell which, made a tiny fissure sound, as though the shell had shifted. She saw no visible crack yet, but the shell's surface glistened with faint lines that might be signs of stress. She let out a ragged breath, unsure whether to exult or panic. They were on the verge of hatching, or so it seemed. Yet she hadn't fully prepared for this moment, unsure of what exactly to do in the crypt's cold gloom, when brand new dragons emerged. A swirl of contradictory thoughts flooded her. Should she fetch Jon? Should she try to coax them more? Perhaps with the flame of her torch or an offering of blood? Instinct took over. She gently set the torch upright against the wall, making sure it wouldn't topple. Then she drew the small dagger from her belt. With careful deliberation, she pricked the tip of her thumb. A bead of blood welled up. She pressed it against the first egg. letting her warmth and blood mingle with the condensation on the shell. Her heartbeat thrummed in her ears. The response was immediate. Another crackling sound, louder this time, and a visible fracture line raced across the egg surface. She pulled her hand back, eyes wide. The shell quivered, light shining off its slick ridges. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then the crack expanded, branching like spider webs. Daenerys found herself unable to move, transfixed by the spectacle. A single piece of shell broke away, clattering onto the ground. A tiny, scaled limb pushed through. Daenerys' breath caught. It was a deep onyx color, shot through with faint streaks of silver. The claw flexed once, scraping at the air. The shell buckled further, and a small head emerged, vaguely reptilian, but with an angular grace, thin membrane sliding over large eyes. It let out a muted squeak, as though not yet sure how to roar. Tears spilled down Daenerys' cheeks. She reached out slowly, terrified of harming the delicate creature. Another piece of shell broke, and the hatchling struggled free, flopping onto the damp stone. It was about the size of a small cat, glistening with moisture, wings curled tight against its body. A faint wisp of steam rose from its skin. Daenerys thought it might be black and silver, but in the torchlight it was hard to tell. It tried to move, letting out a thin, warbling cry that tugged at her heart. Gently, she slid her hand beneath it, supporting its frail body. The hatchling blinked at her, unsteady, uncertain, but very much alive. Daenerys' breath trembled. "Hello, little one," she whispered, overwhelmed by wonder and relief. She brought the creature closer to her chest, letting it sense the beat of her heart. It squirmed, letting out another quiet cry. Heat radiated from it, but not scorching like Drogon or Rhaegal when they grew large. This was more like a feverish warmth. Then she heard the other egg crack. Heart pounding, she laid the first hatchling gently on a bed of cloth she had prepared. She turned to see the second egg fracturing in multiple spots, bits of shell falling away. Another tiny form emerged, a sibling, slightly larger, with scales that appeared a dark gray with flecks of white. Its cries were louder, more insistent. Daenerys carefully helped it break free, cradling it in her arms. This one squawked, flailing its wings, and a tiny puff of smoke escaped its nostrils. She laughed in astonishment, tears streaming down her cheeks. She set the second hatchling near the first, letting them press against each other for warmth. They wriggled and squeaked, blinking in the torchlight. The crypt's hush was broken by these soft new voices echoing off ancient stone. Daenerys felt a surge of maternal protectiveness. These were her children, as surely as Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion had been. She smoothed her hand over their damp scales. They responded to her touch. Still too weak to stand, but already showing the spark of life. Her gaze snapped to the third egg, the one that had remained cold for so long. It sat untouched, no visible cracks. Daenerys' emotions plunged, torn between elation at the two hatchlings and longing for the third. She crawled to it on hands and knees, bringing her bloody thumb close to its shell. She pressed the drop of blood against the hardened surface. The egg did not move. She waited, biting her lips so hard she tasted iron. Still nothing. She tried again, smearing a bit more blood, murmuring words of encouragement. The shell remained silent, refusing to yield. At length, she let out a soft sob of resignation. Perhaps this egg was never meant to hatch. She bowed her head, letting her hair brush against its cool surface. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her heart aching. For a moment she rested there, mourning what might have been. Then the chirp of the newborn dragons pulled her attention. She turned back, wiping her tears. The two hatchlings squirmed, wide-eyed, their world brand new and terrifying. She had to ensure they survived. The crypt, though warmed by the pipe, was still not ideal for such vulnerable creatures. They needed gentle heat, a safe space, nourishment. She recalled how Drogon and his brothers had fed in those early days, on small pieces of meat, warmed by fire. She stood, cradling the two hatchlings in her arms, feeling their delicate claws grip at her sleeves. She had to hide them, keep them safe, until she could reveal them properly. Yet as she gazed at them, wonder intermingled with a jolt of fear. Once word spread that dragons had hatched beneath Winterfell, there would be an uproar. Some might greet it with awe and acceptance, while others might see it as a threat. Would the Northern Lords accuse her of violating some unspoken sanctity of this place? Would Sansa see it as a betrayal, hatching Targaryen dragons in the cradle of Stark ancestors? For a long moment, Daenerys stood still, the hush broken only by the hatchling's soft cries and the drip of water on stone. Then she squared her shoulders. She was the mother of dragons. She had walked through fire and lived. If she let fear guide her, she would betray everything she stood for. The dragons needed her strength, and she needed them now more than ever. Steeling herself, she draped the hatchlings gently in a spare cloak to keep them from the chill. She looked one last time at the third egg, unbroken and dark. She felt a tear slip free, but she whispered a final vow. If there was any spark of life in it, she would not give up. But for now, she had to focus on the living. Carefully, she carried the newborn dragons to the door of the alcove. Outside, the corridor was empty, but for the torchlight dancing on the walls. Grey Worm waited near the main entrance to the crypt, too far to see what she carried. She contemplated how to smuggle these tiny, squeaking creatures to her chambers. A challenge indeed. But she would find a way. If anyone discovered them now, questions would explode beyond her control. She pressed the hatchlings close, feeling their trembling bodies against her own. The hush of the crypt lingered behind her, as though the stone corridors still reverberated with the miracle that had just transpired. Clutching the dragons, she began her careful journey upward, each step a new test of secrecy. Every corner, every shift of shadows threatened exposure. But Daenerys moved with newfound resolve, her heart thrumming in time with the tiny beats of the dragons by her breast. The hush might soon give way to a roar that would echo across the Seven Kingdoms, and she would be ready to face it when it came.